Welcome to the FALA Upcast, a bi-monthly podcast where we watch movies and talk about them. I'm your host, Elizabeth, and today's guests are Indy and
Hello.
Casady.
Hi.
In today's episode, we're reviewing The Batman, a recent release by director Matt Reeves. The Batman 2022 takes on the classic story of Bruce Wayne and approaches it with a film noir style heavily inspired by 40s detective films. Now, I don't feel like I need to give the normal synopsis of like what is Batman because it's such a well-known story, such a well-known character, but I would love to hear from you guys like what your history with Batman and DC is.
Mm-hmm. I can start us off.
Sure.
I don't like superhero movies. I always find them to be kind of boring. I don't think I've actually ever watched one of like the original Batman movies like all the way through. Maybe I've caught like 20 minutes of one because it was like on the TV at a hotel. But like I honestly just, to be quite frankly honest, I did not care. The most Batman content I've ever seen was the Lego Batman movie, which I've probably seen about 4 times. Killer film. Maybe next week we can do the Lego Batman movie.
I actually love that idea. I don't think I've ever watched the Lego Batman movie, and I feel like I'm missing out on a cultural phenomenon.
I feel like we should do Batman extravaganza, just 3 Batman films from 3 different eras.
That would actually be really cool.
It's not a terrible idea.
Yeah.
Just looking at this picture of Colin Farrell. That you're okay? Yeah. Mm-hmm. So my experience with it is I grew up as a Marvel fan, but then I also got really hardcore into Batman around 1995 when Batman Forever was coming out from Joel Schumacher with Val Kilmer as Batman. That film had the Riddler in it. It was Jim Carrey and Tommy Lee Jones as Two-Face. And I remember not being... I was obsessed with those films. They're not very good. That and Batman and Robin, which I've shown to students before. I really like Batman as a character. I'm a fan of like the graphic novels, especially not so much the comic book storylines, but like the more seminal like comic book pieces, graphic novel pieces. I really like, and I liked most of the Christopher Nolan trilogy, so that's where I'm coming to this from.
And so you know a little bit about the comics and the graphic novels. Yeah. And you mentioned that this specific Batman movie is based loosely on...
Yeah, based loosely is a good word for it. I guess we'll get into more structured discussion, but the general impression that I get is whoever, I think Matt Reeves wrote... I know he directed it, but I think he has a co-writing credit probably. Whoever was chiefly responsible for writing this took a lot of inspiration from The Long Halloween, which was a story about that introduced a serial killer to Gotham, and akin to what they're doing with the Riddler in this adaptation. And that took place on Halloween, and it was like that stuff. And then there's Batman Year One is the other one, which is an adaptation of like Batman's first year as a crime fighter, and him forming a relationship with Jim Gordon and the Gotham PD, and like becoming a detective. So this seems heavily inspired by those 2 storylines.
So I mentioned the film noir 40s detective style and kind of those like stylistic choices that they made in this movie. I think that was most clearly shown like through just the cinematography, like the way the shots were lit, the colors, like the overwhelming like darkness and like the groggy weather, all the rain stuff. I would love to hear what you guys thought about those stylistic choices and that kind of like vintagey feeling that they were going for.
I much preferred it to, like I was saying before, I really was not kind of vibing with the whole like superhero aspect. Like I feel like in a lot of Marvel movies it's just like a cash grab, and it's just like big clunky action scenes with lots of CGI. And yes, there were action scenes, but that more like film noir detective like storyline is really what like kept me interested and is part of like what made me want to see this film, is because I knew that it was going to be more of like the narrative based storyline.
Yeah, I think Batman more than any other superhero anything, it's really weird because there have been 5, I keep forgetting about one of the adaptations. There have been 5 live-action adaptations of Batman in the past 30 years. And the first 2 of those were Michael Keaton as Batman, with Tim Burton writing and directing those. So they have a very Tim Burton feel to them. They're 80s and 90s Tim Burton. Joel Schumacher came in and had his own take on like the campiness and colorfulness of Batman and making it feel like a live-action cartoon. Then you have like Christopher Nolan's Batman, which feels like these big, epic, action-y, political, like intrigue thrillers, very cinematic in their feel and their scope. And then you get into like the Zack Snyder Batman stuff with Batman vs. Superman and Justice League, where you have a much grittier, darker, this like grim-dark Batman, the Dark Knight Returns era Batman with Ben Affleck. This, I think, stands to be, I think, the most visually interesting take on Batman that I've seen. Simply because it's like so much rain, it's so much like atmosphere, like quite literally dripping with atmosphere, in a way that like previous films have looked gorgeous to varying degrees, or they had their strengths visually. But yeah, like this has leaned really hard into that noir feel, and that feel of like, it's not trying to be dark and edgy. It feels like, oh, they're just making a movie and they're shooting in low light. And so, yeah.
I loved like the color choices. Like when I think of this movie and I think of like the colors, I would think like burnt orange, red, specifically like the scene at the end when the city had flooded and he has that like flare.
Yeah.
He has a flare,
yeah.
And like the red flare, like lighting this like flooded room. I thought that was the most gorgeous shot. I was like I was like, this is beautiful. Like, I loved the, like, low lighting, all of, like, the warm tones. Like, that's what I loved from the cinematography.
Yeah, I think, like, I should have looked up who the cinematographer, who the DP, the director of photography, and the cinematographer were for this. What I really like about the lighting in particular is, I guess, like, full spoilers for the movie. The theme of this, of, like, Batman, Bruce Wayne, coming to terms with like he doesn't need to be a symbol of fear. Like a symbol of fear can also be a symbol of hope. It can be a symbol of fear to criminals. It can be a symbol of hope to the people of Gotham, those who are in poverty and looking for a better situation. Just like that, the colors of like red and in particular the color of orange, which I think permeates this most of the time. Orange can be like warmth. It can be this like feeling of like, I think of like street lights on a cold night. It's like this feeling of safety, this feeling of comfort. It's like firelight. It's by a fireside, but also orange can be like a pretty scary color in that like amber darkness. Like that feeling can be very cold and uninviting. And so like at the end there with that flare, that color red, being so associated with a symbol of hope and like leadership instead of a symbol of fear that he's been using to strike into criminals, which again thematically ties in with it. I thought it was just great how they used the palette to match the character arc of Bruce Wayne Batman. So
yeah, and I also don't know if this was intentional, but like the fact that the Riddler's color is like green and that is like contrasting color to red, like they're opposite on the color wheel, I thought was cool. I appreciated that, and I'm sure that was like on some level intentional. But speaking of the Riddler, the casting, because I've actually heard I've heard like some really polarizing opinions on Paul Dano as the Riddler. Like I know some people did not like it just because they felt they couldn't like take him seriously as a villain. I mean, he's like a sweet looking guy, but I thought he was phenomenal casting. Like I thought he gave a really good performance.
Yeah, I would have to agree because I feel like having someone really like intimidating for that role wouldn't have worked as well, because I think the whole point of it, like part of the reason why he stays masked, like that anonymity, like creates like a contrast between like him as the Riddler versus I don't know what his actual like non-villain name is.
So in this movie, I forgot what it is. I had it like, I was like, that's weird, but typically it's like Edward Nigma, so he's Enigma. Like that's his comic booky name. It's something less stupid than that. It's like something Nash or I feel like.
Okay. Yeah, but I feel like that was a really excellent casting choice, and just like he was able to like bring the difference in between something like the scene where he's on the phone like with Batman giving him the clues before the bomb detonates versus something like where he's in like the prison cell at like his lowest point, stripped down without the mask, without the costume, just as his enigma self.
Yeah, I think like Paul Dano is a fantastic actor, and like I remember when I heard this casting choice, my immediate thought was this is another Jesse Eisenberg as Lex Luthor. If you've never saw Batman vs. Superman, they cast Jesse Eisenberg as Lex Luthor, and he's like a 20-something like Elon Musk billionaire, right? So his performance is wacky. He's like, Bruce Wayne and Clark Kent. I love bringing people together. And he's like putting Jolly Ranchers into senators' mouths. It's insane. He's just like chewing the scenery every time. With Paul Dano, I think what works really well for it is like you believe him as the serial killer aspect of the Riddler, and like you believe him as this person, and then when he is like unmasked and caught, and especially that interrogation scene in the cell, his baby faceness actually I think lends itself really well to this idea of like he feels like a regular person who donned this persona inspired by Batman, which makes sense when then his like rage comes out when Batman doesn't accept him as an equal, right? And Bruce Wayne is just like, we're not the same. Like, what are you talking about? He's like, well, I did it for you. Like, you're doing vengeance stuff. I'm doing vengeance stuff. And like, I think that works really well. Is like, yeah, this is some kid who thinks really high of themselves. That's what a lot of like criminal psychology says about people who are like serial killers, are super narcissistic. And I think that lends itself really well. And yeah, his performance was like chilling. Like seeing him genuinely lose control when he gets turned down by Batman is like, I had chills for that moment. And yeah, like his performance is phenomenal.
What about some of the other casting in this movie? I loved Robert Pattinson as Batman.
Sorry, that's Robert Patton. Is that Patterson?
I've had enough. I love Robert Pattinson. I have loved seeing like the public opinion on him kind of change, because I think, you know, he was so heavily associated with Twilight, and I think this was like a really big moment in his career. So I don't know, I loved it. I also specifically loved that Matt Reeves committed to emo Batman. I loved that he canonically listens to Nirvana. He journals. He wears eyeliner. Platform boots.
This is the first canonical film version of Batman that has raccoon eyes.
Yeah,
the first
but
one.
In every other one, they're wearing eyeliner. It's just when the mask is taken off, they don't show that. But I loved his like smeared eyeliner. I loved his little hoodie moment. Yeah. I thought I loved the emo-ness, because that is what Bruce Wayne is. Like, he is brooding. He is like so...
I've always felt like people praise those Chris Nolan Batman films. They praise Dark Knight. They praise Batman Begins. Some people like The Dark Knight Rises if you're a fan of bad films. But in particular, like, I always thought Christian Bale's portrayal of Batman in those was like the rich playboy guys. Is like, there's the scene in Batman Begins where he's like, sir, your dinner dates can't swim in the swimming pool. And he's just like, well, I'll tell you what, here's a check. No, sir, we can't, no amount of money. He's like, it's okay, I just bought the hotel. So like he just buys the hotel, he rolls up in a Lamborghini, like all of these things are like the facade of like, oh, I'm Bruce Wayne, I'm a party boy, like, so nobody suspects me as Batman. But he does such an amazing job. This is the best Batman on film, I'm just gonna say it, that I've ever seen. Because of those reasons, like because he is insecure and like he's projecting his insecurities into what he does. And like I think that's a phenomenal take on the character, because that is what the character is about.
Yeah.
I also feel like he really brought like a lot of range in like in the way that he can kind of like use that stillness and like those moments where he'll just be like walking out of the shadows, but I feel like really just bringing like a presence and like creating like an atmosphere, which I know is also like in large part due to like the cinematography and the writing, but I feel like some other actors wouldn't have been able to kind of like get into that headspace, I guess.
In a lot of the scenes, he feels like the most imposing and terrifying threat in the frame. I think the chase scene that he has with Penguin which we'll probably talk about a bit.
Yeah.
At least talk about Penguin a bit.
Yeah.
The chase scene is phenomenal, but like when Penguin has the like I got you moment, he's like, oh, I got him, the Batmobile's crashed, Batman's done for. When Batman comes erupting out of the flames, it's not heroic, triumphant Hans Zimmer score of like the Batman theme. It's literally a horror music stinger of like, oh no, the slasher villain, the bad guy is actually still alive. And so it projects Batman as a force to be feared, which is obviously his goal in year 2 of being Batman. So yeah, it's like it's such it treats it well, and like Robert Pattinson leans into that sense of fear and foreboding in a way that doesn't just feel one note and boring.
Yeah. I actually would love to talk about the car chase scene because I am like not a fan of car chases in movies. Like I don't find them like interesting. I've never watched any of the Fast and Furious movies. I'm actually not a fan of like action scenes in general. Like I just don't really care about like high stakes, like fighting, that sort of thing. But this was so like nauseating to me. Like it really like grips you. Like the editing, it's like all these fast-paced shots and they're all like cut together and it's like flashing in your face, like all these really short clips. And like it was just the combination of that and the score, like it just felt so like anxiety provoking. Like that is my worst nightmare situation.
And it's like driving the plot forward. You care about the chase because at this time in the story it's setting the Penguin as like the informant character, right? It's like setting that up. So you're like, you want Batman to catch him. But at the same time they set up that chase where like Batman is so relentless during it that you get a sense like there's like a slight fear. Like you sense the anxiety of the character of like this is an unstoppable force and like, oh my god. But yeah, just like the way it's edited, and again the color palette where it's just that orange and it's fire and it's explosion, like contrasted with Batman's like the blue. I love the design of the Batmobile in this film so much. It looks so good. But yeah, like it sells like the anxiety, intensity, and it's like it feels claustrophobic because it's also at night. Everything takes place at night except for like the funeral in this movie. Everything else is nighttime though, and so like. Yeah, you care about the stakes, you know what's happening, and so it can do that quick editing because you're aware of the action taking place and why it's happening.
It feels like so real. Like this is like a nightmare scenario. Like Elizabeth was saying, like driving on the highway is something that I'm terrified of. And like this fear I feel like is so real, and it was like so suspenseful because we're like left waiting like what's gonna happen. And like the seats, I saw this in theaters and like the seats were like shaking, and it was just so like I feel like it was just really like immersive. Like I couldn't look away. And then there's that scene at the very end where I think it's like a flipped shot, and it's just Robert Pattinson like walking towards the camera with like these flames in the background, like so menacing. There's like just no like,
and that's a trailer
remorse.
shot, but it's an inventive trailer shot. It's a really cool looking shot. Yeah, and again it sells the Batman as an unstoppable force of fear and menace, which again until the very end of this movie, like that's who Bruce Wayne perceives himself as. And so like the cinematography and the directing make us buy the exact feeling that Bruce Wayne wants us to have of Batman.
Yeah, I like on him walking out of the flames, like that shot,
so good.
It like is carried throughout the movie. Like there's so many just shots of him just walking slowly towards like a victim, I guess.
The slow walking down the hallway where it's just illuminated by gunfire.
Yeah.
Terrifying.
Yeah.
It's so when he just straights up this the very end when he starts his more or less like just trying to kill straight up the people who are dressed as the Riddler, or even when he shows up to the Iceberg Lounge and he just like breaks the like nose or just like beats up the thugs that are at the door, right? Like just nonchalantly doing it. Like it means nothing, and it's like terrifying.
I also appreciate though, like I felt almost as if, I mean obviously the Bat costume is like kind of unrealistic. It's kind of ridiculous, honestly. Like if the see him like next to all the detectives, it's pretty ridiculous. Like, but I like that they like. The suit was clearly heavy. Like he has these loud, clanky boots, you know. It's like seems hard to move around in. I like those little details that I feel like kind of really sell it as more realistic than I've seen from other superhero movies.
Yeah, I honestly love the as goofy as because the movie doesn't treat it as goofy, because it's like so atmospheric. Like you can buy this costume, like you can suspend your disbelief in believing this costume exists, which then, because if the costume did not work, or if like the tone of this movie was any different, I would be bursting out laughing every time it's just him casually standing at a crime scene talking with Jim Gordon about like, we gotta find these guys, like, well, who's so and so, like it's the most ridiculous looking thing. But because this movie sells itself so well, I loved any scene where it's just like Batman, like as an amateur detective, and the cops at this point are like, what are we supposed to do with this guy? And like Jim Gordon's really the only person who talks to him. So it makes for a really like, I really like just seeing a guy in a bat costume standing at a crime scene talking about a serial killer. And I'm like, yeah, this is good. This is very comic book-y, but I believe it. So
on the costume choices for like the Riddler and Catwoman, though, is that like her canonic name? I am not
sure. So her canonic name is Catwoman. It's Selena Kyle.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Selena Kyle. Like their outfits I feel like are more realistic, but for their character choices, I feel like it works. Like if they all had these kind of like decked out suits, it wouldn't have the same feeling as like the Riddler just being this kid who just kind of like got this idea and just wanted to like execute all of these like big powerful people, and he's kind of like, it's like a scrappy costume and it's like realistic, it's like military grade, and like same with like Selena Kyle's, it's like a little crocheted.
Just so we're clear, I'm just going to show a photo for the folks who are in this room. This is what Jim Carrey wore as the Riddler in 1995.
Oh no.
He also wore he wore a sequined leotard at the very end of the film and spiked up his hair.
That is bright.
It's pretty incredible. But yeah, I agree though. Like I think they obviously, so they mentioned taking Paul Dano mentioned taking a lot of inspiration from the Zodiac Killer, and you can see that in both the costume choice, where it's very much like a mask and like a heavy trench coat essentially, and so that's very, very Zodiac Killer like. But you also see it in his portrayal of the character, where he's leaving riddles around, and like there's a lot of things where like the Zodiac Killer and like even Jack the Ripper, going back to the 1800s, took the most pleasure in this like giving the police a runaround, leaving clues behind, and then taunting when they felt they were smarter than the detectives that couldn't catch them. And so it made a lot of sense there. With Catwoman, similar, not a serial killer, but like, Selena Kyle as a character, I think Zoe Kravitz was phenomenal in this. I love that the way they kind of leave this open for a sequel is with her leaving Gotham, believing it can't be saved, and then Bruce Wayne, a rich billionaire, finding solidarity with the people of Gotham and thinking that it is worth saving, which is this great like deconstruction of like what is otherwise a really classist character. It's like the whole meme of like, well, if you're a rich billionaire, why aren't you just like helping people instead of just doing vigilante work? Like, what are you doing? Yeah. But yeah, I think the costuming was like, yeah, everything on the production design of this was phenomenal. It because it all works well, and especially they obviously tested it to look good in low light. Like that's the other thing too, is like Batman costume can go real wrong if you can't see that costume, and they make sure you can see it. So
yeah, I know we've been talking about the Riddler a lot, but one thing that I was so shocked that it is PG-13 rated, like, because within 30 seconds you see the Riddler commit like gruesome murder. Yeah. And from that very beginning shot, I thought we were seeing it through like Batman's eyes. Like I thought it was Batman, and then it's like the Riddler, and I thought the crimes the Riddler committed were like pretty disturbing, and I was like pretty surprised. I know that they got away with it because they didn't like show
like the scene
graphic.
The scene with the mayor, right? It's like it's
right. Yeah. But it was like they used sound in a way where like it's like disturbing to hear what's going on, but then like I kind of appreciated that we didn't have to see like gore. We didn't have to see super graphic stuff.
It's not like Saw. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, like I appreciate it when movies will like blur or like have a shot kind of far away.
Out of focus, yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate that because I don't really see the point in like shock, horror, gore, especially for this type of movie.
Yeah, this reminded me a lot, like tonally, of. Did you ever watch the Daredevil Netflix series that I guess is now on Disney Plus?
I watched part of it. Yes.
Okay, yeah. So it reminded me a lot of that tonally. Obviously that was like TVMA, but like it goes for that same vibe. This movie was heavily inspired by Seven. I think Matt Reeves has talked about that. It's a David Fincher film from like 1997 about a serial killer. In like tonally and visually, this looks a lot like that. That was hard R because it had a lot of that shock value stuff in it. But yeah, I was honestly surprised. Like my brain was like, I remember going into it, I'm like, this feels more R-rated than that Justice League Zack Snyder cut that's R-rated, because that just feels so fantastical and gory and over the top for the sake of it, whereas this is leveraging its fantasy violence to serve the purpose of creating a film that feels heavier and more atmospheric. And so like you said, like the sound design is brilliant at like conveying that without having to show it. We know, okay, yeah, the Riddler's killing somebody right now. We understand that. And just it's just, there's so many creative ways that they do that. And like seeing like blood written on the walls, like is still like, that's something that to me, who's like immune and desensitized to any form of gore, that's really effective at building atmosphere, while getting away with like technically gore. So.
Right, I feel like all the violence in this movie was very like intentional. It didn't have these big, like, something that I was saying that I really just despise is like the big like CGI fights that like I just feel lost in. But I feel like this was every like bit of, I guess, gore that they used was used to like follow a storyline, and it like had purpose and it had intention. And also something that was just so, I feel like, sickening was just that it's all very like real. Like this is something that could happen. Like it takes heavy inspiration from serial killers, and it's like something that I feel like is making a commentary definitely on like corruption and power, but it's doing it in a way that it like uses the violence to like, I don't know, promote these ideas.
But even that, like, even just like, you know, I mean, the serial killing, I think like mass violence, right? Like tragedy, like the funeral scene, for example, as an example of that, or when it shows Paul Dano in the diner and he lets himself get arrested, and you see him and it's like his face with that haircut, with his glasses, that looks like I feel like it's a mugshot I have seen on the news when a tragedy happens, and it's like, hey, here's the suspect of it. And so like it is this an indictment of that, which then again makes sense thematically for it, because then Batman recognizes that he has created this problem, and he's like, oh, by being a symbol of fear, I'm inspiring things that now scare me. So that like causes him to have some hope and be like, okay, well, maybe I can do good things instead of just breed more violence. So yeah, that commentary is I think really well done.
Yeah. And like the city of Gotham itself like feels like it is like a real city. Like the way that is just so like riddled with like crime and like poverty, like the scene that we get inside the orphanage that's been abandoned and like people are like living there, and it's because it's like unsheltered people are going to go to like this place, but like for, I feel like, a character like Bruce Wayne and some of the other adaptations, he might just be like so detached from like the issues of Gotham that it doesn't like really make sense for the Batman storyline.
Yeah, and like kind of seeing, you know, how they, I mean, in the movie it's like drop heads, like the main drug is like drop, and like how that's intertwined, and like the political leaders are doing it and they're like all like it's all like involved and like intertwined with like mobs and like but just like seeing how that affects like the like lower classes of Gotham way more than like those politicians and stuff who can get away with like doing these like skeevy things and have no consequences. I thought that was like commentary I appreciated.
Yeah, and we talked, I think Elizabeth, you had mentioned this outside of this podcast, but you were thankful that this wasn't another like origin story thing. Because this is the fifth adaptation of Batman in film. People know Batman's backstory. It's like the same thing as like a Peter Parker backstory. It's like kid bit by radioactive spider and his uncle dies. Cool. This is, you know, Bruce Wayne loses parents, They get killed in an accident in the alleyway. They're shot and killed. It skips that part, but then like that orphanage scene in particular, and like those connections of this, like, oh, these issues are classist in their nature, and they affect you depending on where you fall in the socioeconomic like line. Essentially, for somebody like Bruce Wayne, it's like he was an orphan. He was orphaned at a younger age, but because of his status and name and place in society, did it affect him mentally and emotionally? 100%, but it did not affect his stature in life.
Yeah.
And so like he has that personal sense of that feeling of like he was lucky and he's not wasting the chance that he has, obviously. But like, yeah, that connection that he makes is like, yeah, like the politicians are doing this drug and people in poverty are doing it. It's obviously not impacting the politicians. It is impacting those who are in poverty. Bruce Wayne was orphaned, but because he was born into upper class, he was fine. Like he had a safety net under him, basically. So
that like scene where the Riddler is like saying like, you're not an orphan, like you don't know what it's like to like not have any support system, and like he was kind of telling like little like short like things that happened about like in his childhood, and like one of the things was like rats, like mentioning like the orphanage was like in such a poor state that they were like living with rats and like babies were dying in the cold. And then the way that like the rat motif is kind of carried throughout his crimes, and like carried throughout his riddles, and like, oh, gotta like find the rat. I liked that connection a lot, and I think there was like a lot of thought put into the Riddler's backstory at least, and I liked not having to see Batman's backstory again, just because it's such a well-known character. And I like that this movie gives the audience like the benefit of like, you already know who Batman is. Like we don't need to explain who Bruce Wayne is to you again. So that's what I appreciated from it.
The rat motif, I feel like, was also just like so, I feel like it really worked with like the character of like the Riddler, and I think was just pulled off really well because it has all these different meanings. Like it's seen in the orphanage, and it's seen in the way, I forget who it was like one of the politicians was killed like by a rat, but it was also like the informant, and it's kind of like this symbol of like, you know, like rising up from nothing and just getting what little resources you can, and like
Now, I know we've been praising this movie a lot, but one thing that, like, the only thing that I could, like, focus on in some scenes is, like, the dialogue. I think, okay, I understand, like, the banter between, like, the detectives and, like, when they're doing their crime-solving, like, thing. Like, I understand that, like, fast-paced back and forth, like, very much inspired by 40s detective films, the manner in which they speak to each other. And I do understand, like, that the dialogue must have been written the way it was for stylistic choices. But in some moments, the lines were just delivered and written in ways that, like, really pulled me out of, like, I feel like it was a realistic universe. Like, I feel like I didn't have to suspend my disbelief that much. Like, I was pretty much like, yeah, this seems based in reality a little bit. But sometimes the dialogue would kind of pull me out a little bit. It would just be, like, very cliche, cheesy lines delivered in cliche, cheesy ways.
I have a thing about strays. Why'd they have to spell it out like that?
Yeah, a lot of that I feel like is tied into, like, the... So I mean, here's what I'll use to explain, I think, the dialogue, in my opinion. And, like, this is one of the biggest strengths of the film, and also one of its shortcomings in case of the dialogue. And in some cases, where, like, I think visually this movie has a very strong sense of identity. If I were to knock it for anything, some of those dialogue things are part of it. Also, I think it's the least, besides, like, Zack Snyder's Justice League, I think it's the least memorable Batman theme. I think the music is really good in a lot of parts, but, like, if I'm looking at it as a movie, I think the performances of the cast and the visuals of the film are its strongest points. So the thing I'll say is, like, to its credit and to its fault, it is slavishly faithful to feeling like a graphic novel that has come to life on a film screen. It is visually striking. It has moments that look like a panel in a comic book. a lot of that chase scene, for example. Or like the Riddler standing on the balcony at the funeral, for example. That's like a beautiful looking shot that looks like straight out of a graphic novel. But then what else it comes down to is, at the end of the day, it was anchored by the fact that this is a Batman comic book movie. So yeah, we're going to have cheesy dialogue because the expectation in comic movies is they're accessible to everybody. So that means we're going to either dumb down the dialogue or make the dialogue like have these like silly little quips. Like,
Yeah.
I have a thing for strays. Yeah, I was like, oh God. And I'll say, I think that's the bigger weakness of this film, whereas like in the Christopher Nolan trilogy, I think the dialogue was more or less fantastic across the board. But again, those were like Batman films second. They were political thrillers first. This is a Batman film first. And so, yeah, it has some campy, cheesy dialogue because going back to the 30s is where those stories are rooted in. So,
to kind of wrap up this episode, I would love to hear what your guys' like favorite, least favorite characters were, and maybe like one scene that particularly stood out to you.
That's tough. As far as performances, I think every performance is phenomenal. I gotta say that. I love Jeffrey Wright as let's call him Jim Gordon because I forget if he was like started as sergeant or lieutenant or however. The Nolan movies had him as a sergeant, then a lieutenant, then commissioner. So I'm like, but yeah, I think Jeffrey Wright as Jim Gordon was really well done. I also really liked him as Felix Leiter in Casino Royale and the Daniel Craig James Bond films. I thought, I'm going to point to Colin Farrell. Colin Farrell is an actor I really like. I've liked a lot of stuff he's been in. He was the only watchable thing of the Daredevil film from 2003 when he played Bullseye. And he killed a woman with a cashew on a plane. He plays the Penguin. And the entire time going into this, I'm like, I know who Colin Farrell is. I've seen a lot of Colin Farrell movies. I can't believe this is Colin Farrell. Because in any other capacity, you would cast any heavyset actor to play this heavyset character who's a crime boss. Okay, do a New York accent. The fact that they chose Colin Farrell, who clearly has a lot of passion for the role, is the most unrecognizable I've seen an actor in such a long time. But yeah, aside from that, I think Robert Pattinson is my favorite live action Batman so far, because he is the most successful at blurring the lines between Bruce Wayne and Batman in a way that I feel like every other actor has played Bruce Wayne as Bruce Wayne and Batman as Batman. Christian Bale, again, great actor, but when he's Batman, he's just a rich person and he's arrogant and cocky. And then when he's Batman, he's doing this voice. It's terrible. I think his Batman is the weakest part of those films. So yeah, I think every performance was excellent. Special shout out to Batman and Commissioner Gordon for their actual performances. Penguin for the performance. Honestly, Riddler, Zoe Kravitz is everybody's my favorite is my point.
Yeah.
Favorite scene. I really like the confrontation in the cell between Paul Dano and Batman. Paul Dano and Robert Pattinson, sorry. Riddler and Batman talking. The reason I like that so much is because it's really the first time we get to see Paul Dano crush it. And as soon as he feels because he thought he had Batman figured out, and when he is told no, that's not what I'm about, he loses it because he was wrong. And if anything, he does not want to be wrong. He wants to know everything. And so he goes from that, and then when Batman talks about what do you mean what's next? What's happening next? And when the Riddler finds out he has the upper ground, he's like, oh, you haven't solved everything. He's like, I gave you too much credit. He feels empowered because now he realizes, no, I am smarter than this guy. And I loved that from the perspective of I love my villains, especially in Batman. To me, he's a little unhinged because Batman is just a little unhinged. And so it was really cool to kind of see that moment happen. And I just thought it was the dialogue was especially great, and it was the two leads that's doing an amazing job delivering it. So,
I feel like for those reasons, that's why Batman, Bruce Wayne, Robert Pattinson is, I would say, my, favorite character. Basic answer, you go see the Batman, who's your favorite character? The Batman. But I mean, I feel like it's not without reason. Like, that scene, like, he doesn't give much away, like, in his facial expressions, but you can tell that he is, like, caught. He is trapped. There's, like, he doesn't, like, see a way out. And also to just see his, like, character progress from, like, being that, like, dark vengeance to being that, like, light of hope, I feel like is... like, not the most subtle, but it's definitely very, like, interesting to see all these things culminating in this, like, almost 3-hour film, like, which, but I just mentioned it did not feel like 3 hours.
No,
I loved those 3 hours.
It was the Dune effect.
Yeah.
Yeah, but, like, this is actually our longest movie that we've watched on the channel, at about 12 minutes longer than Dune. But also...
Yeah, I was just saying, I love the touch, by the way, that throughout the entire film, like, all the criminals are just like, here comes vengeance. Like, they all just call him Vengeance because of the who are you? Vengeance. And then that comes back full circle to, like, the Riddler's followers. Right?
Yeah.
Like, I think that's... I loved that little motif being also the name of Batman for most of the movie.
I don't know what they put in this movie, but because I'm not somebody who can sit through long movies, but I thoroughly enjoyed those 3 hours. I really want to go see it again. I don't think it was like earth-shattering, changed my perspective on the world, but it was just like really fun to watch. Like, I just think it was done well, and I'm not someone who's like a big fan of like hero crime fighting movies, but I think the way at which it was done was like tasteful, and I liked it. I don't know. I think that might be it, unless anyone has any closing thoughts.
I hope they get the sequel. They've been talking about like ideas they have for a sequel. They leave it wide open at the end for what it could be, and I think they have an ARG, an augmented reality game for the folks at home, that they've been running, and it released a bunch of dates, and those dates were significant parts of the comic books as well as significant dates for the trailers for the film. But there's one date that stood out that references the date of the first issue that introduces Arkham Asylum, which is where obviously Riddler gets locked up with unnamed prisoner that is credited on IMDb.
AKA the Joker.
AKA the Joker. But it's also the issue where like Harvey Dent escapes from Arkham and wreaks havoc as Two-Face. And so if that's teasing a sequel, then I am fully on board I want this to be a new trilogy, because like Matt Reeves, the last trilogy he did was Planet of the Apes, which is a phenomenal trilogy of modern sci-fi remake film things. So yeah, I hope a sequel happens because I'll 100% watch it.
I am kind of on the opposite side. Like, as much as I enjoyed this film, I kind of don't want a sequel because I am worried that like with the pressures that like Hollywood puts on like directors, like I feel like this took a lot of time in the making, and a lot of that was because of like, you know, COVID and Robert Pattinson not wanting to do the things that he was supposed to do to get ripped for this film. Like, I'm just worried that it's going to be produced with not as much care as this one was taken. But that being said, it was also like I left the theaters being like, I want to go see it again. So like if they did make a sequel, like I would definitely go see it, but I just hope it keeps that same like feeling and production value that the first one had.
All right. I will see you guys in 2 weeks. Bye.
Bye.